Welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today we're getting into the weeds of U.S. lawmaking, Congress specifically. You've given us some interesting excerpts talking about the House, the Senate, their powers, and how those representatives keep getting reelected.
It really is a jungle out there in the world of legislation. Understanding how those two chambers, the House and the Senate, work together, well, it's key to understanding how anything gets done, or doesn't get done, in American politics.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so let's break this down. We'll look at the differences between the House and the Senate, kind of like two separate teams, and then we'll uncover the strategies politicians use to stay in the game. Because, and maybe this isn't a surprise, it's not always about serving the greater good.
It's definitely a balancing act. You've got the needs of the nation, the needs of their constituents, and of course their own desire to stay in office. But before we get too deep into those strategies, let's take a step back and talk about the bicameral structure itself. The House of Representatives and the Senate. It didn't happen overnight, you know.
Oh, I bet there's a good story there. Founding fathers, probably arguing over some obscure point of principle.
You're not wrong. The Great Compromise, as it's known, was all about bridging the divide between large states and smaller states during the Constitutional Convention. Larger states, they wanted representation based solely on population, more people, more power, right? Which is how the House of Representatives came to be.
Makes sense. Each representative speaks for a chunk of their state,
Yeah.
and they're the ones who have to answer to the voters every 2 years, right?
Exactly. Those two-year terms keep representatives on their toes. They're constantly feeling the pressure from their constituents, which makes the House super dynamic, very responsive to whatever's happening at the moment. But here's the thing. It can also create a focus on the short term. Quick wins to please voters, even if it's not what's best for the country in the long run.
Short-term thinking. Got it. Okay, what about the senators? They're over there in their fancy chamber with their 6-year terms. They don't have to worry about re-election nearly as often.
You'd think that, wouldn't you? The Founding Fathers, they saw the Senate as this sort of cooling saucer, a place for more measured deliberation. Each state gets 2 senators, regardless of size, representing broader interests and with a bit more time to, actually think things through. But here's where it gets really interesting.
You're killing me. Tell me more.
Well, you'd assume that those comfy 6-year terms would make senators almost unbeatable when it comes to re-election. But get this. Almost 90% of them get reelected. That's where political scientist David Mayhew comes in with his theory about the, shall we say, art of the political reelection machine.
Okay, now we're talking. Ditch the textbooks. Let's hear about Mayhew and his reelection playbook.
He breaks it down into 3 main tactics: advertising, credit claiming, and position taking. And this isn't just theoretical stuff. It plays out in some pretty fascinating ways in the real world of politics.
Let's start with advertising. Sounds simple enough, but I'm guessing it's more than just putting up a few campaign signs.
Oh, absolutely. Name recognition is huge. You'd be surprised how many people can't even name their own representative. So politicians, they have to get creative. Take Congressman George Shipley, for example. He was a machine when it came to meeting constituents face-to-face. It's estimated he personally met with something like 200,000 people in his district.
200,000 people. Wow. I guess when your job is on the line every 2 years, you can't afford to be shy. Still, even with all that handshaking, it seems tough to stay top of mind. Did Mayhew have anything to say about that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Besides those in-person charm offensives, some politicians found ways to keep those communication channels open, and some got really creative. Congressman Charles Diggs, for instance, he hosted a radio show for years. Mayhew described it as this fascinating mix of disc jockey, commentator, and minister. Talk about reaching the masses.
Imagine tuning in for that. That was Mozart, and now a word from your congressman about that new bridge proposal.
Right. It makes you wonder, is it about genuine connection or is it just savvy campaigning? Whatever the reason, these examples really show the lengths politicians will go to make sure voters remember their name, especially as Election Day draws near.
For sure. And speaking of staying fresh in voters' minds,
Yeah.
What about this franking privilege? Free mail, just because you're a member of Congress, seems a little convenient, especially with an election coming up.
Yes. You've hit on one of the, let's say, more strategically advantageous perks of being in Congress. You're right. The franking privilege lets them send mail to their constituents for free. And you better believe those mailbags get a workout, especially in those months leading up to an election. It's all part of the game. Free mail reminding everyone who you are, what you've done, right before they head to the polls.
Right. Okay, so advertising, check. But what about this credit claiming that Mayhew talks about? Sounds a little self-serving, doesn't it?
It can be, for sure, but it's also how politicians show their constituents that they're effective. Basically, it's about connecting their actions in office with actual tangible benefits for the people back home. Like, imagine a representative gets funding for, say, a new bridge in their district. Every time someone drives over that bridge, what happens? They're reminded of who made their commute a little bit easier.
Show, don't tell, right? Look what I did for you. But do people actually make that connection? Does anyone really thank their representative for a bridge?
You'd be surprised. Mayhew calls these particularized benefits, those specific individual favors that representatives can do. Helping someone with some government bureaucracy, getting a grant for a local school, even a shiny new bridge. It creates this sense of, I don't know, obligation, maybe even gratitude that can be really powerful when it's time to vote again.
Makes you wonder, though. Do those particularized benefits, as helpful as they might be for some people, do they sometimes come at the cost of the bigger picture? Like, maybe that bridge money could have gone to something that helps the whole country, not just one district.
Now you're thinking like a political scientist. That's a question that scholars and honestly everyone struggles with. Does this focus on individual districts, on bringing home the bacon, as they say? Does it distract from those bigger national issues? It's a tough one.
Definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered advertising, credit claiming, 2 down, 1 to go. What about this position taking? This one seems trickier, less straightforward, maybe even a little manipulative.
Ah, yes, position taking. This one takes a certain finesse. It's all about saying the right thing to the right people at the right time, right? You have to appeal to your base, your core voters, but you don't want to alienate potential voters either. So as you can imagine, that often means adjusting your message depending on who you're talking to.
I can see how that could get awkward, especially for representatives who have a really diverse group of constituents. Did Mayhew have any examples of this whole position-taking balancing act?
Oh, he did. Congressman Edward Roybal, he represented a very diverse district. He once said he would often find himself giving this patriotic, pro-military speech to one group, and then later that same day, he'd be giving this passionate anti-war message to a different group. Talk about a tough crowd.
That's like walking a tightrope but without a net.
Mm.
It really makes you realize how much strategy goes on behind the scenes. Politicians are always thinking about their words, about how they'll play with different voters. Is it genuine? Are they really representing their constituents? Or is it all just a big performance?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a reminder that politics, well, it's often as much about how things are perceived as it is about actual policies. And those two things don't always line up.
It's a little disheartening, honestly. It makes you wonder if any of these politicians actually mean what they say, or if it's all just part of this game to get reelected.
I hear you. It can be cynical. But putting that aside for a moment, understanding these tactics, the advertising, the credit claiming, the position taking, it gives us insight into what shapes how politicians act. It lets us as citizens engage with the process in a more, I'd say, informed and critical way.
I appreciate that perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on this re-election playbook, but we haven't really talked about the actual, day-to-day work of Congress, how a bill actually becomes a law.
It's true. We've gotten a bit sidetracked by the strategy of it all, the political maneuvering.
Yeah.
But you can't understand Congress without understanding that legislative process. And trust me, it's way more than a formality. It's not just a rubber stamp on whatever the president wants.
Oh, I bet. I imagine it's a long and complicated process with lots of twists and turns, probably even a few roadblocks thrown in there. So tell me, what's this legislative obstacle course all about? Where does it even begin?
Well, remember, we've got our two chambers, the House and the Senate. And for a bill to become law, it needs to pass through both of them. And it's not as simple as, one agrees, sends it over to the other, boom, done. They don't always see eye to eye on things.
And let's not forget about the president, waiting in the wings, ready to veto anything they don't like.
Exactly. The president, they have a lot of power in the process. Even the threat of a veto holds a lot of weight. But let's back up for a second. First, a bill has to be proposed. Can happen in either the House or the Senate. Except for tax bills, those have to start in the House. That's in the Constitution.
More power to the people, I guess, when it comes to our wallets. But okay, so a bill is proposed, then what?
That's where the real fun starts.
Yeah.
Both the House and the Senate, they have these systems of committees, lots of them. Each one focuses on a specific area. You've got foreign affairs, agriculture, education, you name it. And these committees are where the really detailed work on the bill happens. They hear from experts, they propose changes, amendments, and things can get pretty heated.
Sounds like a recipe for some political drama. So the committees, these are where bills either get refined or they kind of die in a pile of paperwork.
That's a good way to put it. Committees, they can be places for real innovation, for compromise, but they can also be where good ideas just get stuck. It's all part of how democracy works, or doesn't work sometimes.
So the committees, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Mm-hmm.
Either a bill makes it through or it gets stuck. But let's say it does make it out. What happens next?
Well, if a bill survives the committees, it goes to the full chamber for a vote. Could be the House, could be the Senate, depending on where it started. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because both chambers, they don't just have to pass the bill, they have to pass the exact same version of it.
Wait, so it's not like a term paper. You can't just send it back and forth with edits. Needs more cowbell.
Not quite. It's more like a high-stakes negotiation,
Yeah.
If the House and Senate, if they end up with different versions, which happens all the time, they have to work out the differences before anything goes to the president.
How do they do that?
They have these things called conference committees. Basically, it's a group of members from both the House and the Senate, and they're tasked with, hashing it all out, finding some kind of compromise.
Sounds like things could get tense. I bet those conference committee meetings, that's where the real politicking comes in, right?
You could say that. It's a lot of back and forth, trying to balance different ideologies, different priorities, sticking to your principles, but also recognizing when a compromise is the only way forward. And remember, this whole time, all those re-election tactics we talked about, the advertising, the credit claiming, the position taking, it's all still happening in the background.
So it's like this whole other layer of strategy.
Right.
Every move, every vote, it's not just about the policy itself. It's about how it'll look back home to the voters. Makes you wonder, does all this pressure to get reelected, does it help or hurt the process?
That is the million-dollar question. It's at the heart of how we think about our government, really. On the one hand, you could argue that this re-election pressure, it keeps politicians accountable. They have to answer to us, the voters, every few years, and that gives them a reason to listen to what we want.
That makes sense. But then again, doesn't that same pressure, couldn't it lead to politicians making decisions for the short term? Just trying to get reelected instead of doing what's best for the long haul.
It's a tough one, and there's no easy answer. The Founding Fathers, they created this system of checks and balances, and it's both really resilient and really complex. And this whole idea of how Congress works with all its moving parts, all its contradictions, well, understanding that is key to being an informed citizen.
Well said. Knowledge is power, right? So next time we see our representative's name, maybe it's on a mailer bragging about something they did, maybe it's a news clip of them giving a speech, or maybe it's even just driving over that bridge they got funded. We'll know what's really going on.
Exactly. We'll be able to ask ourselves, is this about serving the people or is it about getting reelected? And how do those two things, how do they work together?
Definitely something to think about. Well, that is our deep dive into U.S. lawmaking, specifically the wild world of Congress. Thanks for joining us, and remember, go out there and be the most informed people at your next dinner party.